Welcome to the debate. We are not wading into the shallow end today. We are diving straight into one of the most, well, volatile, high-stakes intersections of history, religion, and identity politics that's currently circulating. I'm talking about the battle for the identity of ancient Israel. You see it in viral clips, you hear it in urban centers, specifically the insistent claim by groups like the Black Hebrew Israelites that the original biblical Israelites were exclusively black and that this identity has been, systematically stolen or covered up.
It is intense. And usually when people talk about this, it's just a shouting match. It's ideology versus ideology. But what I appreciate about today's session is that we aren't here to shout. We are here to dissect a very specific, rigorous analysis titled Abraham and the Genesis of Covenantal Identity. And the question this material poses is fascinating because it sort of bypasses the shouting and goes straight to the root. Does the historical reality of one man, Abraham, support this claim of racial monopoly? Or does his origin story actually blow the whole concept of race out of the water entirely?
I'm going to lay my cards on the table immediately because I think the text demands it. I believe this analysis provides a definitive, factual refutation of the Black Hebrew Israelite position. And it doesn't do it with feelings or theology, not primarily. It does it with geography. My stance is that historical geography is the decisive hammer here. Abraham originates in West Asia, specifically Ur and Haran. And because of this hard, physical fact, any claim to an exclusively African origin for Israel is historically incoherent. You cannot have an African tree grow from a strictly West Asian root.
To stop you, not because your map is wrong or is absolutely in West Asia, but because your focus feels, well, a little too narrow. You're treating Abraham like a biological specimen under a microscope. My position, and what I think the text actually supports, is that the geography is secondary to the covenant. The text intentionally ignores racial markers to define Israel as a created theological identity. So when we try to argue whether he was black or white, we are committing a categorical anachronism. We're forcing a modern binary onto a man who existed, upstream of those divisions.
Upstream is a nice poetic image. And I know you love the theological angle, but we're dealing with a claim of monopoly here. The argument on the street isn't Abraham was complex or Abraham was a theological creation. The argument is Abraham was black and only black and everyone else is a fraud. And to refute a monopoly, you need hard boundaries. The text gives us one. The Bible doesn't start with a misty concept. It starts with a man moving across a specific map.
But does the map tell us who he was? Or does it just tell us where he walked?
It tells us where he emerged from, which, dictates who he was. The source material is explicit on this, and we really need to slow down and look at the trajectory. Abraham moves from Ur of the Chaldeans to Haran to Canaan. Now just pause and think about what that means historically. If you look at a map of the ancient world in the 2nd millennium BC, that puts him squarely in the Mesopotamian sphere. This is the West Asian, Near Eastern, Levantine, Mediterranean world.
Meaning what specifically?
Meaning he isn't coming from the Nile Valley, he isn't coming from sub-Saharan Africa. And to be fair to all sides, he certainly isn't coming from Northern Europe. He is a man of the Near East.
So you're setting up a negative argument, essentially.
I'm setting up a factual boundary. The populations of Ur and Haran were not African. They were Semitic-speaking peoples of the Near East. So if Israel begins with Abraham, and Abraham is a Near Easterner, then Israel is a Near Eastern entity. The claim of a black monopoly collapses right there at the starting line because the progenitor simply isn't there. It's like claiming a monopoly on French wine but admitting the grapes were grown in Idaho. It just doesn't work.
I see the logic, and I don't dispute the archaeology of Ur, but the source material warns us about getting too bogged down in where he came from because it risks missing what he was in the eyes of the narrative. The text emphasizes that Israel is a covenantal reality. God says he will make a nation out of Abraham. And this is a crucial distinction. He didn't find an existing nation, say a tribe in Africa or Europe, and just rename them. He started with one man.
But he didn't make that nation out of thin air. He used raw material. And that raw material was a man from, well, modern-day Iraq or Turkey. You can't separate the man from the material.
True, but look at the silence of the text. The Bible goes into great detail about his herds, his tents, his family feuds, his altars, but it is remarkably silent on his skin tone, his eye color, or his hair texture. And that silence has to be deliberate. It suggests that while you are right about the geography, the text wants us to understand that Abraham predates our modern racial categories. He represents a humanity that is upstream of the black-white binary we're obsessed with today. When we try to pin him down as our guy racially, we're asking the text a question it was designed to ignore.
I appreciate the theological nuance, I really do, but we have to deal with the structure of the argument presented in the material. It's not just about silence. It's about the mechanics of how a nation is built. The source highlights a concept that I think is the nail in the coffin for the monopoly argument, but it requires some unpacking. It says, Israel is personal before it is plural.
That's a dense phrase. I can hear eyes glazing over. Unpack that for the listener. What does personal before plural mean in a practical sense?
Okay, think of it this way. Most nations in history are formed by extraction. You have a big group of people living in a region, say the Egyptians or the Canaanites, and a leader rises up, or a border is drawn, and you say, okay, this group is now a nation. You extract a group from a larger population.
Right, you draw a circle around a crowd.
Exactly. But the source argues that Israel was formed by creation. God didn't draw a circle around a crowd. He started with one single man. He says, I will make you into a great nation. This means the identity of Israel is locked into the identity of Abraham. It exists in him before there are tribes, before there is a law, before there is a land. The nation is, in effect, the expanded biography of one person.
Okay, so the DNA of the nation is the DNA of the man.
Precisely. And this is crucial because it stops us from what the source calls retrojecting. You see this constantly in these debates. People look at the 12 tribes or the mixed multitude later in the Bible, they see diversity, converts, different backgrounds, and they try to paste that diversity back onto Abraham. They say, look, Israel was diverse, so the founder must have been this generic diverse figure. But the source says you can't do that. The root determines the nature of the tree. If the root is West Asian, the tree is rooted in West Asian soil. You cannot use the diversity of the branches to change the nature of the trunk.
I have to push back on that root and tree analogy, though. It feels a bit too rigid. While I admit the one-to-many structure is biblical, Israel begins as one man, the source material also warns us against flattening Israel. You are arguing for an origin, but the dissenter in the text, which I'm aligning with here, argues for a destiny.
Meaning what?
Meaning, God's promise was expansion. I will make you a father of many nations. If we lock Israel too tightly into the biology of the one man, we risk implying a new type of racial purity, just a West Asian purity instead of a black or white one. The danger is taking Israel as personal and turning it into Israel as exclusive. We don't want to replace black essentialism with West Asian essentialism.
I'm not arguing for exclusivity in the future. I'm arguing for exclusivity in the past. The black Hebrew Israelite argument is one of past exclusivity, that the ancient Israelites were black and only black. To refute that, we have to look at the physical reality of the ancestor. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable part of the source material. We have to talk about whiteness.
I'm wondering when we would get there. This is where the ice gets very, very thin.
It is, but we have to walk on it because the source material goes there. The analysis explicitly states that Abraham's Near Eastern origin overlaps significantly with populations that today are often classified as Mediterranean or Middle Eastern white.
We need to be incredibly careful with how we define that. When a listener hears white today, they aren't thinking about genetics. They're thinking of Scandinavia or the UK or colonial America. They think of a very specific socio-political history involving power and colonization.
Agreed. And the source clarifies that. It distinguishes between modern political whiteness and ancient population groups. But it notes that scientifically the populations of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean belt, the Levant, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, are ancestrally connected to modern populations we call white.
Connected, yes. identical, no.
But that connection matters for the logic of the argument. The specific claim by many Black Hebrew Israelites is that Israel cannot be white, that it is a physical impossibility. The advocate in me looks at the data and says, look, if Abraham comes from that genetic belt in the Near East, you cannot say it is impossible for his descendants to be white. The genealogy allows for it. In fact, the genealogy makes it quite likely that there is a shared ancestry there.
I understand the biological argument, but I recoil a bit at using the term white here without massive caveats. The source material urges caution for a reason. It explicitly states Abraham was not white in a modern ideological sense, nor does he conform to European stereotypes.
But you cannot deny the connection.
I don't deny the connection. I deny the label. Abraham is a bridge. He belongs to a zone that feeds into Levantines, Arabians, and yes, Europeans. But he is the fountainhead, not the estuary. If we try to claim him as a white icon, just despite the claim of blackness, we are falling into the same trap of identity politics. We are just playing for the other team. We are taking a Near Eastern nomad and trying to make him a European ancestor figure, which is just as ahistorical as making him a West African chieftain.
I want to be clear. I am not claiming him for a team white. I am dismantling team only black. The goal here is to dismantle a monopoly. The source material asks a very direct question. Did I disprove the Black Hebrew Israelites' monopoly? You decide. And I argue the answer is a definitive yes. You cannot have a monopoly on a house if you didn't build the foundation.
I will concede that the monopoly is disproven. The geography and the text make that clear. You simply cannot maintain that monopoly given the Ur-Hanan trajectory. But I want to offer a vital nuance here regarding exclusivism versus inclusion. Because when people hear Abraham was an African, they often hear Africans don't belong in the Bible.
Which is absolutely not what is being said. And if that's what people hear, we need to correct it.
But we have to say it loud and clear. The source highlights that this analysis does not deny the presence of Africans in biblical history. Cushites, Egyptians, Ethiopians are all there. They are major players. Nor does it deny the possibility of them becoming Israelites via conversion. It only denies the origin story being African. This distinction preserves the dignity and inclusion of all groups without falsifying history. We can have a biblical history that includes Africans without falsely claiming the patriarch was African.
That is a crucial distinction. Facts shouldn't exclude dignity, but let's look at why this matters for the rest of the Bible. The argument often shifts to spiritual Israel or covenant identity to avoid these hard biological facts. People get uncomfortable with the DNA talk, so they say, well, it's all spiritual anyway. But I argue that biology is still relevant because the source mentions Jesus.
How so? Jesus is usually the point where people say biology stops mattering.
Not entirely. Even with Jesus, the source argues that the distinction is covenantal entry, but it relies on the framework Abraham established. The source says Israel is the vessel through which later fulfillment occurs. The biology of the Near East, that specific bloodline, that specific geography, was the vessel chosen. You cannot bypass the vessel to get to the theology. The theology is incumbent on the vessel existing. Jesus had to be a descendant of Abraham, geographically and biologically.
That is an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The source says Israel is the vessel through which later fulfillment occurs, not the biological source of divine identity.
Break that down. It sounds like a distinction without a difference.
It's a massive difference. It means that while the vessel, the biological line, was necessary for history, it is not the source of the identity's value. Covenant identity is primary. Race is not. The ultimate refutation of racial exclusivism isn't just Abraham's DNA or his migration from Ur. It is God's definition of him. God chose a man from a messy polytheistic region and defined him by a promise. That promise is what makes Israel Israel, not his blood type.
So you're saying the miracle of Israel trumps the material of Israel.
Exactly. The miracle is that a nation was formed by a call, not just by breeding. But to your point, that call happened to a specific man in a specific place. We cannot erase the map just because we like the theology.
And that brings us back to the central thesis. The source material is very strong on this.
Israel does not originate as a demographic or ethnic collective. It originates as a covenantal reality constituted in a single man. But, and this is the big but, because it is constituted in a single man, that man's history becomes the nation's history. You can't rewrite the start of the movie just because you want a different ending.
Yes. And this is why the 12 tribes argument is so often misused in these racial debates. I hear this all the time.
Right. People look at the tribes later in history, Dan, Judah, Ephraim, and say, look how diverse they are. Look at the descriptions.
Precisely. The text says Israel did not begin as 12 tribes. It began as one man. The tribes are a later unfolding. Racial arguments often depend on flattening Israel into that later socio-political form, looking at the mixed multitude or the scattered tribes, and then retrojecting that diversity back onto the single progenitor.
Which is historically backward. It's like looking at a modern American crowd in Times Square and saying, the Founding Fathers must have looked exactly like this diverse crowd.
That's a good analogy. You can't confuse the result with the source. Scripture moves from one to many. Abraham is Israel in inception. The tribes are Israel in distribution. You cannot use the distribution to rewrite the inception.
And I think that is where the argument for the black monopoly really loses its footing. It relies on a flattening of history. It relies on taking scattered pieces of data from later centuries and trying to paste them over the face of Abraham. But Abraham's face is set. He is looking toward Canaan, coming from Haran. And let's talk about the silence of the text again. The source material points out that the Bible is remarkably silent on skin tone.
Which again implies they aren't important for salvation.
It implies they are irrelevant to covenant identity. This silence is not accidental. It prevents the very kind of racial gatekeeping that later movements attempt to impose. When modern groups, whether white supremacists or black Hebrew Israelites, insist that Israel must look a certain way, they are importing categories foreign to the text. The text doesn't care about melanin, it cares about faithfulness.
I agree. But I want to push back slightly on the it doesn't care aspect. It doesn't care about melanin for salvation, perhaps, but it cares about truth for history. The source material argues that Israel cannot be racially exclusive to Africa because Israel originates with a man who is not African. That is a statement of historical truth. And if we allow people to rewrite that truth in the name of theology or inclusion, we are no longer dealing with the Bible. We are dealing with fan fiction.
That's a compelling argument. We cannot allow the text to be consumed by our modern desires. The source text actually calls this speculative anthropology and modern grievance frameworks.
Modern grievance frameworks. That is a powerful phrase. It suggests that these racial claims are born out of modern pain, not ancient reality.
And I think that is the compassionate read of the situation. People are looking for identity. They're looking for a place in the story. They feel cut off from history, so they try to claim the root. But the dissenter and the source material would argue that you don't need to hijack Abraham's ethnicity to find a place in Abraham's family.
Well said. You don't need to change his history to share in his inheritance, but to claim that his history is your specific racial history, to the exclusion of all others, is simply false.
And this brings us back to the issue of the Middle Eastern white classification one last time. I want to circle back because it is so controversial. You mentioned that the region is ancestrally connected to modern white populations.
Yes. The source says this clearly. It's a genetic reality of the Mediterranean basin.
But it also says this. This does not mean Abraham was white in a modern ideological sense. We have to hold both of those truths. He is ancestrally linked to Europe, yes, but he is also ancestrally linked to the Arab world. He is the bridge.
He is the bridge, but the bridge is anchored in the Near East. And that anchor point disproves the claim that the bridge starts in Africa. That is the logical limit I am trying to enforce.
I accept that limit. The geography is stubborn. You cannot move Ur to the Congo.
Exactly. And you cannot move Haran to the Nile. These are fixed points. And because they are fixed, the identity of Israel is fixed in a specific cultural matrix. This matrix is West Asian. It is Semitic. It is not sub-Saharan.
So if we accept that, if we accept the geography, the genealogy, and the covenantal nature, what are we left with?
We are left with a complete collapse of racial exclusivism. The source material concludes, in the end, Abraham alone is sufficient to disqualify racial exclusivism. You don't need complex genetic studies. You don't need linguistic gymnastics. You just need Abraham.
And that is a liberating thought. One does not need speculative anthropology or symbolic overreading. One needs only to let Abraham stand where Scripture places him.
It restores order. That is the phrase the source uses. It simply restores order. When we stop trying to make Abraham look like us and let him be who he was, the confusion just dissipates.
I think intellectual charity is essential here. As we wrap up, I want to reflect on that. While the Black Hebrew Israelites' claim of exclusivity is factually incorrect based on the text, the deeper truth found in the material is that we must stop imposing our modern conflicts onto ancient texts. We should let Abraham be upstream of our modern conflicts. He isn't a weapon for our culture wars, he is the father of the faithful.
That is a beautiful sentiment, but I will end with the cold, hard facts, because that is what restores sanity to this debate. Israel begins with Abraham. Abraham is West Asian. Israel unfolds within the Levant. This simple sequence restores order. It doesn't matter how much we want the story to be different. The story is what it is. And when we accept that, racial absolutism dissolves.
It seems we have found a point of convergence. Abraham stands as the anchor that stabilizes history.
Indeed, when he is allowed to remain in his proper context, Haran, Canaan, the arguments for racial monopoly simply cannot stand.
We invite you, the listener, to read the text on its own terms. Look at the geography, look at the covenant, and decide for yourself if the monopoly has indeed been disproven.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate. We'll see you next time.